Hello everyone, here is Lydia talking about the movie for you. Today's movie is a love story, Pride and Prejudice. It tells the romantic love story of Elizabeth and Darcy. Squire Bennets had 5 daughters, and Mrs. Bennet's greatest wish was to find a husband for each of them. One day, Mrs. Bennet heard that the nearby Netherfield garden was finally rented out. The tenant, Mr. Bingley, is a wealthy bachelor, and he earns £5,000 a year. So Mrs. Bennet urged her daughters to meet Mr. Bingley. He hopes to have a daughter to tie the knot with him. At the ball the next day, Bingley really fell in love with their eldest daughter at a glance. Jane, who is beautiful and kind, also has a good impression of Bingley. At the party, which has more male than female, Bingley persuaded Darcy to dance with the ladies and told him that Elizabeth was pretty and agreeable. Darcy's evaluation of Elizabeth is okay.
I dare say, not handsome enough to tempt me.
Unfortunately, this was just heard by Elizabeth. Darcy's arrogant image planted seeds in her heart. Elizabeth is outgoing, lively and lovely, and is the apple of her father's eye. But in fact, Darcy has already been deeply attracted by Elizabeth's liveliness and cuteness. All the evening of the dance, he did not take his eyes off Elizabeth.
So what do you recommend to encourage affection?
Dancing. Even if one's partner is barely tolerable.
It's just that he's introverted and not good at expressing himself. The next day, Jane received a letter from Mr. Bingley and invited her to dinner at Netherfield. The shrewd Mrs. Bennet insisted on riding her horse instead of in a carriage, as expected.
I shall have to stay the night, exactly as I predicted.
Having to stay at Bingley's house temporarily, the family couldn't laugh or cry at Mrs. Bennet's shrewdness. Elizabeth values sisterhood. When the sky clears, she walked to Netherfield to see her sister. Although the bottom of the skirt, shoes and socks are all mud, a look of embarrassment. But she is not inferior, she is still calm. Here she met Darcy again, because two people had misunderstanding before, and Darcy is a man of poor speech. So the meeting began and ended with bickering. Elizabeth also took her sister home when she left. In accordance with the law of England at the time,
Mr. Collins at your service.
Since Mr. Bennet had no son, in the end, his property can only be inherited by his nephew Collins. This is why Mrs. Bennet especially wants to find a good husband for her daughter. Collins was short, talkative, and self-righteous. After a dinner,
Possible.
Oh, believe me, no one would suspect your manners to be rehearsed.
Collins confides to Mrs. Bennet that he is fond of Jane and wants to marry her. But Mrs. Bennet informed him of Jane's engagement and recommended their second daughter, Elizabeth. Collins, after a moment's reflection, readily agreed. The Bennet daughters meet a handsome soldier, Wickham, near a military camp. The Bennet daughters meet a handsome soldier, Wickham, near a military camp. But Wickham is good at rhetoric and inverting right and wrong, and claims to be the son of the Darcy's accountant. Darcy's father treated himself like a son. But when Darcy's father died, Darcy ignored his father's will and drove him out. After this, Elizabeth's misunderstanding of Darcy deepened. At the next dance, Darcy, who loved Elizabeth so much, finally plucked up the courage to invite her to dance. But due to Elizabeth's misunderstanding and prejudice, the conversation between the two remained unhappy. Not long after, cousin Collins proposed to Elizabeth, but she refused. Mrs. Bennet stood up and asked her daughter to agree to the marriage. Fortunately, the sensible Mr. Bennet supported his daughter's decision. This matter has just come to an end. To make matters worse, Mr. Bingley left Netherfield without saying a word. Only Bingley's sister wrote to Jane. He wrote that his brother had a more suitable marriage partner. Jane packed her clothes and went to her uncle's house in London, hoping that Bingley would get news, then visit her. This is Jane's last way to save love. After another time, Collins and Elizabeth's good friend Charlotte got married, so Elizabeth went to their home to see her good friend. Lady Catherine just happened to invite them. Mrs. Catherine was the patron of Collins as the parish priest. She is also Darcy's aunt. Here, Elizabeth and Darcy met again. The love in Darcy's eyes could not be more obvious, but Elizabeth, blinded by misunderstanding and prejudice, still doesn't realize it. To make things even more unfortunate, Elizabeth learns from Darcy's friends that it was because of his persuasion that Bingley abandoned Jane. This made her feel even more resentful towards Darcy. One rainy day, Darcy finally could not help but confess his love to Elizabeth. Faced with the confession of a wealthy, handsome man, Elizabeth told Darcy bluntly that she hated him.
Tempt me to accept a man who has ruined, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister.
Blaming him for driving Wickham out of the house against his father's will, so she rejected him. Darcy finally left disappointed. Before he left, Darcy left a letter for Elizabeth. He explained the two misunderstandings, that his father had left Wickham a large fortune, but Wickham gambled so lavishly that he lost his fortune in a few weeks. Darcy, on the other hand, saw nothing but snobbery and vanity in Mrs. Bennet. Believing that Jane was not genuinely fond of Bingley, he persuaded his friend to give up the attachment. After Elizabeth finished reading the letter, she had a new understanding of Darcy. She dispelled the prejudice against him in heart. When Elizabeth returned home, she found Jane had arrived from London, and Bingley never visited her. She now has to work her way out of her broken heart. It was not long before her uncle and aunt came to visit. Elizabeth decided to join them on their journey to see the beauty of nature. On the way, they decided to visit Mr. Darcy's house in Pembury. Elizabeth had not intended to agree to the proposal, but hearing that Darcy seldom stayed at home, she agreed. Coincidentally, Darcy returns from London a day early, and he and Elizabeth bump into each other. In order to keep Elizabeth at home, he went to Elizabeth's uncle and aunt, and invited them all to dinner.
Pleasant about his mouth when he speaks.
This made Elizabeth feel differently about Darcy. Elizabeth and Darcy finally get along well this time. Before their visit was over, Elizabeth received bad news from her family. Her youngest sister Lydia eloped with Mr. Wickham. This was a very serious matter at that time, which not only ruined her own reputation, but also caused problems for several elder sisters in the family to get married. After a while, her uncle wrote to say that he found her sister and Wickham. But Wickham demanded £100 a year before he decided to marry his sister. Mr. Bennet saw at a glance that it was not so simple. Wickham's demands were too easy. It must have been the generosity of his uncle to give him more money on top of that settled the matter.
10,000. Heaven forbid.
Elizabeth learned it from her sister when Wickham and her sister were at their house. Mr. Darcy paid for the wedding, for the commission of Wickham's army, and so on. It was Darcy who solved the problem for her family. Since then, Elizabeth's previous prejudices against Darcy have turned into a sincere love. Bingley, who was still in love with Jane, restored to Netherfield again. He came to Bennet's house with his friend Darcy, personally confessed his mistakes to Jane and proposed marriage. The two still love each other deeply, so Jane agreed without hesitation. When they were gone, the whole family were overjoyed, and Jane's love was at last on good terms. Elizabeth understood, just as it had happened to her sister Lydia. Mr. Darcy must have had a hand in this too. That night, Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, came into the house. She said that hearing of Eliza's intention to approach Darcy,
I must ask you to leave immediately.
I've never been thus treated in my entire life.
Elizabeth got up early next morning after a bad night's sleep. Standing in the field, she saw Mr. Darcy coming from a distance. Coming to the front, Darcy once again expressed his heart to Elizabeth. Darcy, from the first arrogant to gradually attracted by Elizabeth, can't fall in love with Elizabeth on his own, changed his arrogant attitude towards others. Wealth and identity do not represent a person's ability. Although Collins was lucky, he couldn't be a gentleman because he didn't have a gentleman manner. Because of this, Elizabeth doesn't like him at all. Darcy was a gentleman. He knew Wickham's character, but he had not revealed him to anyone. After being rejected by Elizabeth, she realized that she was an arrogant and conceited person and gradually changed himself, let him get Elizabeth's heart, and finally embrace the beauty. Elizabeth has her own opinion, does not fear power, and dares to pursue happiness. Do not talk about marriage for any conditions other than love. Please follow me if you like my video. I am Lydia. Thank you for watching.